Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. So in the previous video, we saw a pretty complete and robust SAP UI5 application, which we built from scratch, seeing how we can reuse parts of the various wizards without having to run the wizard itself. We accessed no data service, but we did it dynamically at runtime using logic in our controller. We also called a RESTful service, but we did it just by relative URL. So the idea of that previous exercise was more to give you kind of the overview of a large-scale application, but in broad strokes. We didn't go super deep or detailed into the specific parts or scenarios. And I think now it makes sense to go back and let's create some more targeted applications, a little smaller scale, but we'll look at different aspects. And once again, we're not going to cover everything about SAP UI5, but we are going to look at typical use cases and patterns that fit into the HANA native development environment. And one of those is obviously a lot of use cases call OData services, and we've seen how we have a model object in SAP UI5 that we can bind to the external OData service, and it does a lot of the processing for us. We're not having to deal with HTTP request response or the raw JSON that comes back or parsing of the metadata. That model object does all that work for us. But sometimes you want to call just a regular REST service, and not like we did last time in the last video, just by relative URL, and then that really only works when you have, as we did, like a file download coming. We want to send maybe some parameters to the server, and we want to get some data back, in which case we probably want to use an AJAX call, an asynchronous JavaScript call, and we'll use the jQuery library that's embedded inside of SAP UI5 to help us make those calls. In this case, we're going to use an XSJS service, but this could just as easily be used with a custom Node.js RESTful service via the handlers as we've been creating in these videos as well. All right, so let's go back to the web IDE and our web module, and let's create in our resources another application here, another web application. Let's call this one Multiply. And we're going to want a pretty similar structure to what we had in our previous exercise. We're going to want an index HTML for direct execution and testing. Then we're going to need the component.js and the corresponding manifest. And then, of course, we are going to want a view. View.xml, and we're going to need a controller. All right, our project structure looks pretty good there. And so let's start with the index HTML. It's going to be a really similar bootstrap. You're going to see that most of the index bootstraps are extremely similar. We're not doing a whole lot of processing there. We're just saying what libraries we want to load and where to find our SAP UI5 version. And that's not going to vary too much, at least in our applications. We're still going to use the UI5 as a service from XSA, same theme, same basic libraries that we're using here. The mobile, the .m library, not actually the mobile library. That's what it was originally called. Now it stands for the main library. The layout, the unified. So basically the same libraries we had before. We use the same startup script. It's written very generically to initialize the component. We took a look at that in the previous video. We're going to use that over and over again. I designed that intentionally so it's extremely generic, easy to use. We're able to just say shell startup when we want to launch the shell, give it our component ID, and then that will create the basic frame of our application. Component.js, also very similar to the previous exercise. Not a whole lot going on inside of here. Let's bring it in. So it's basically just saying we're gonna load the metadata for this application from a manifest JSON once again. Same initialize the message box message toast so we have it available to use, and same destroy. Nothing too exciting going on there either. Now let's take a look at the manifest. So this is also not wildly different than the previous exercise. Let's bring it in here. Initialize the resources, the icons, not too much else going on here. We do specify our root view. Obviously our the structure that we initialized here, our resource roots are different. SAP shine next, XSJS multiply, and then view app. So we tell it which view to initially load. That's the main thing that we have going on here. We're not going to use resource bundles in here. We're going to keep it a little simpler. We're going to hard code our text. There's no models that we're utilizing. There is a JSON model that we could use even for AJAX calls, but I'm going to show you just low level and kind of direct interaction here rather than defining a model for binding, because this is such a simplified example. And now let's look at our view. This is going to be pretty simple. Let me bring the code in, and then we can see it in the WYSIWYG viewer to give you an idea of what the UI is going to look like. Let me just grab that. Let's put it in the view, and then let's have a look at it in the layout editor, so you get an idea of what our user interface will be. It's going to be pretty simple. We're going to have 2 input fields, and then we're going to have a field here that will be live updated. So as I type into either of these fields, it's going to send the value immediately to the server. On the server, inside of an XSJS service, we'll do the multiplication of the 2 values together, and then return the results to the client side and display it right away in this area. Not that we couldn't do multiplication on the client side. This is not a very wow kind of example. We're just really using this to show us the mechanics of the communication between the client and the server side service here. So don't get too hung up on what we're doing. As I said, it's not terribly impressive. If we do go look at the XML, once again, we're declaring the namespaces for the libraries that we're using, the main library, the MVC, the core library. Most of this is coming from the main library, so we create a panel, as you saw, and then an input field for value 1 with a live change event. Value 2 input field, same live change event. That way, as I type, it's going to trigger an event. It's not going to wait for me to press enter. And then someplace where we can put the results. Now these are bound to a local model here. We'll see that in a second in our component controller. So we are using binding. We're still not directly. You want to try to avoid whenever you can directly interacting with the DOM, injecting values into the HTML fields. Still good to use binding, even when we're not going to use a model to call our service. We're going to use AJAX directly. But you'll see that here in the controller in a second. So let's get the general structure of our controller. We can actually just go to our, if you wanted to, we could grab some of this from our previous example, or OData view. Let's grab the controller here, because kind of this basic structure here is largely the same. So we'll grab that. Our define here is we really only we don't need a base controller. We can take that out from the simpler example. We actually don't have a JSON model here. We're just going to do SAP UI core MVC controller. There we are. Actually, that's good there. Function. controller. Looks good. Use strict return controller. So we're going to initialize via our controller. We're going to extend it. We're going to add some event handlers to the basic MVC controller from SAP UI5. We're going to put our proper namespace on here. Next.xsjs multiply controller app. That's all good. And now we're going to come here and we're going to add an on init. That's good. And in our init, we're going to initialize our model. Equals new SAP UI model JSON. Model. Initialize it empty there. There we go. Get on the end there. All right, and this get view. Set model, so set this as the default model in our view. That's how we get our bindings to our UI elements without naming a model. This get view add style class, just to add the SAP UI size compact. There we go. And that is good enough to get us started. Now, the main thing that we're going to want here is we're going to want to add this on live change event. So we've prepared that as a snippet. So we'll come over here and grab that snippet. There we are. And if we look at what it's doing, so we're going to get access to the view. We're going to use the model to get the data out of the bound model to the view. That's going to get us the current values of our input parameters into this result object. We're going to get access to the controller. And what we can see here is we need to do a test to see which UI element triggered the live event. And depending upon which one triggered it, either get value 2 or value 1. And then if it's undefined, then we'll send a 0. So if nobody's typed anything into it yet, we'll send a 0 to the server side. Then we want to call the service SAP HANA demo content EPM services multiply XSJS. So that would be here in our XSJS module, SAP HANA demo content EPM services, and then multiply is right here. Not a whole lot going on. It gets 2 input request parameters, num1, num2, multiplies them together, takes the answer, converts it to a string, and then passes it back in the response. So we build the URL with the num1 and num2 as part of the URL. Be sure to escape it so we don't get any bad SQL injection, although we're not doing SQL, so don't have to worry about that too much in this case, but you should check for things like that. And then we're going to use the jQuery AJAX, tell it what URL we want to call, that it is a get as opposed to a put, a post, or something like that. The data type we expect is JSON, and then 2 event handlers that we haven't created yet, but we'll create in a second. One when it's done on the server to handle the results and inject them back into the screen, and one to handle any errors. Okay, so now we need to add this onComplete multiply event handler. So let's go grab the snippet for it. Put that right there. And the logic here, basically we're going to get the results, because it's an event handler that we've triggered, that we've hooked into jQuery AJAX. The input parameter is going to be the body of the the return of the response. So already parsed into JSON because we said that was the data type to expect. So the jQuery AJAX API is going to do all that work for us. That's really quite nice. And then we're going to get access to the UI element that has the results. If the value we got back in my text is undefined, then we want to go ahead and set the value to 0 in the screen. Otherwise, we want to use a SAP UI5 number formatter and tell it that it's an integer. So to do nice formatting on it, and then put that formatted value back into the screen with the set text. Okay, and we need an error handler. So let's go get the code for our error handler. And this will also round out our controller. All the closing brackets there, yep. So if there is an error, then once again, the jQuery AJAX is going to pack this error object with like the status code and text and things like that. So what we can do is we can check for different status codes, 500, 400. That means something went wrong, obviously. We can take the response text from the error, and maybe we take that object, and inside there, the way that it packs this, we can see an error, inner error. That's what we want to output if there is an error, inner error. Otherwise, we go to error, inner error message. You know, just handling different situations here where maybe different types of calls to different server-side implementations pack the error results in the body differently. So then the resulting JSON from jQuery is a little different. I wrote something generic here that handles different scenarios. But at the end, what we want to do is we want to get that out as a message box. At worst, if we don't have inner error details, we'll just take the HTTP status text. It's probably not going to tell us a whole lot. It's probably going to say like server, just a generic server error. It's always better if there is a more specific error message that we try to extract that out of the error body, as you see the logic does here. But worst case scenario, we at least want to let the user know that something went wrong. You know, I was reformatting the indentation and everything in here as we went along, but I also could have used the beautify option. I like nicely formatted code. Those of you that come from the ABAP world, you'll know that is like pretty print. We have that on some of the editors here, particularly the JavaScript-based ones. It does a really good job of it. The XML ones as well. The editors, they have a beautify also. So tend to use that on the code snippets. Makes it a little more readable. But I think we're good. We got our error handler, our two input fields, or one output field. Pretty straightforward, easy to use application. Let's go ahead and rerun our web module to pick up the changes that we just did. And what we see here, once again, you know, by default, it launches the index HTML. Maybe I'm going to be testing the same application over and over again. And you can actually come here and you can change the run configuration. Or you can create multiple run configurations for different applications as we build multiple applications in here. I'm actually going to take the run configuration that we have here, and I'm going to change it so instead of running the base index HTML, that it's going to run our multiply index HTML, and that way every time I run it, it's automatically going to launch that. If I'm going to be testing the same application over and over again, it's just a nice little convenience feature to be able to change this. Later, we're going to see some other scenarios where, you know, you can run it with mock data and support assistant, and we'll even see an option here to run it inside the Fiori Launchpad. Once we've created some more advanced applications, we'll use that as well. All right, so let's save and run that. There's not really any changes for it to make, but now you see it runs directly our multiply index HTML. And if we did everything right, 12 times 12, 144. If you want to see what it's doing technically on the server side, let me bring my window in a little bit more here. Let's look at the developer tools. And anytime I change something here, you see it's making a call immediately to the server side. You can see how it's built the URL here, put the num1, num2 values on the URL. The response comes back. pretty straightforward. It's just a value in the body, which then gets injected into the screen. And as we type, you're seeing it make calls. That's pretty nice responsive UI. We get the automatic round trip and the injection of the screen. We're seeing the formatting here. If I do we're getting too large a number here, aren't we? There we are. Decimal points, commas, because it's reading my locale and automatically formatting the number using that SAP UI5 number formatter. So we've seen a couple different techniques that are useful here, but in a little smaller use case. We've certainly seen how to call a RESTful service directly via AJAX, how to interact with the screen without directly doing model binding all the time, how to call a service without a model object, how to use a number formatter. So we'll continue in the next video with some of these smaller scale scenarios, but looking at more and more specific use cases as well.